On the night of August 4th, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had allegedly attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Days later, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was passed by Congress, authorizing the United States to intervene militarily in Southeast Asia. For all practical purposes, the Vietnam War had just begun. Just to the north, China was watching closely and becoming increasingly nervous about their own security situation. Having recently had a falling out with the Soviet Union, American allies surrounding it, and now a war on its doorstep, China felt very much surrounded. Leadership in Beijing settled on one course of action: to prepare for an invasion, not in some future, but now. A major part of this would be the construction of the Third Front, one of the largest and most secretive industrial projects in history. Aside from China's difficulties abroad, the country was in a fragile state internally. The Great Leap Forward had left the country in a desperate economic state, with agriculture and industry almost entirely collapsed. China was in no position to fight a major war, so, in the early 1960s, China began devising various plans and strategies for how to survive a potential conflict. Defense Minister Lin Biao was the first to float the Third Front idea, though this was more a general suggestion to relocate some factories inland. Experience from World War II, where both the Soviet Union and China had been forced to move much of their industrial capacity, inspired this idea. Most of China's industry was concentrated along the coast and in the northeast, where a bombing campaign or nuclear strikes could easily cripple the country in a war. China was developing its own nuclear arsenal and successfully tested a bomb in 1964, but these weren't credible threats. China lacked a missile able to hit Moscow until 1971 and couldn't reach the American mainland until 1981. Lin Biao's idea was formalized as the Third Front in 1964, where it would be a major part of the Third Five-Year Plan. The strategy would be to organizationally split the country up into three distinct sections based on their vulnerability to attack and invasion. The Third Front would be the most interior, and mostly in mountains, designed to provide support for guerrilla warfare in the event China would be invaded. Huge amounts of industry was planned to be moved into literal mountain wilderness and deserts to build whole new towns and cities from scratch. This would require relocating 16 million people, approximately the population of the Netherlands, to these new settlements. Mao Zedong proposed the plan to the Politburo, though it found little support. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, the two men who were de facto in charge of the economy, dragged their feet. They already had a plan drafted, focused on increasing agricultural and light industrial production along the coast. Liu Shaoqi remarked that the primary reason for the Great Leap Forward's failure was the lack of logistics and infrastructure, as well as unrealistically high production targets. The idea of doing the same thing again, but with even higher production goals and in more remote areas, raised a great deal of concern. Deng Xiaoping also commented that resolving the daily shortages of basics like clothing and food should be the country's priority, and that material incentives would raise overall productivity. It wasn't until the US began large-scale bombing campaigns in North Vietnam that the Politburo approved the idea. Some facilities had been moved even before the program officially began, however. Most notably, Premier Zhou Enlai had ordered most of the country's nuclear research to be moved to remote mountains in 1963, after a rumor spread that the US was preparing a preemptive strike on Chinese nuclear development sites. The plan was formally enacted in August of 1964, banning the construction of new industrial sites along the coast and allocating resources for the construction of new locations deep in the interior. The first major projects would be concentrated in the southwest, these being the Panzhihua Steel Complex in Sichuan and the Liupanshui coal mines in Guizhou. 3 new major railroads would also be constructed in the area. These projects were part of the Big Third Front, and every province was instructed to also build their own Small Third Fronts. These were provincial weapon stockpiles and factories, producing small arms like rifles and explosives for the sake of supporting a guerrilla war. Many were even built on the sites of former communist guerrilla bases during World War II. Construction followed the Third Front motto of dispersed, hidden, in mountains. Every province would eventually have a small Third Front to some degree, with even Beijing setting up weapon stockpiles in the western hills of the city. Construction of Panzerhua steel was the highest priority for the plan on the national level. Mao repeatedly fought against the concerns brought by others in the government about the project. At one point, Mao even said he would personally ride a donkey to the proposed site to oversee the construction and fund it himself if the party didn't approve his plans. Eventually, though, most of the critics were won over and the project began in late 1964. The potential sites for the project were so remote that the survey teams had to literally ride donkeys into the mountains to reach them. The actual construction began in early 1965 when the government embarked on a battle to construct the road network for the industrial complex. The whole Third Front project was actually framed by the government as a nationwide mass mobilization just for building things rather than a real war. Unlike the Soviet Union, where workers on projects were given material incentives to get the work done, China opted for purely ideological motivation. Partially because Mao believed in this, partially because the government had basically no money, and paying even regular wages for government employees was difficult, let alone any type of bonus. Construction workers were called soldiers, tools were weapons, and work areas were front lines. These soldiers even had to participate in swearing-in ceremonies where they made oaths to fight against the American imperialists and Soviet revisionists. Since the organizational structure was closer to that of a military campaign than anything else, workers often had no set schedules and worked long days. Proper housing also generally wasn't available, with most sleeping in tents. Conscription was used to gather the bulk of the manpower needed for the jobs. Workers weren't technically forced to relocate to the Third Front, though they would lose their existing job if they refused. There were some volunteers, mainly those from rural areas looking for higher wages, though these were a small minority. Going wasn't framed as a punishment, however. It was actually supposed to be an honor, a sign that the worker was a trustworthy individual. The slogan for recruitment was, "Good people and good horses go to the Third Front," meaning only the best individuals and equipment would be sent. Because the projects had to be dispersed and concealed, construction and logistics costs were enormous and often got behind schedule. The railway between Chengdu and Kunming, intended to be the backbone of the Third Front's southwestern core, was fraught with issues. The railroad stretched over 700 kilometers, with 427 tunnels and over 80 river crossings. The construction effort mobilized 350,000 people, with an average of 2 workers dying for every kilometer of railroad completed. Although ultimately completed in 1970, the railroad wasn't publicly announced until 1974 due to the secrecy of the project. The number of these secret projects kept expanding too. Mao initially was content to just have things like steel mills and coal mines hidden away, with the idea that these could be built out into a defense industry if needed. But eventually, he wanted more advanced military facilities built too. This included a sprawling small arms factory near Chongqing, air and missile bases in Guizhou, and even a few satellite launch centers. Old projects that had been abandoned or incomplete from the Great Leap Forward were also revived, and these weren't small. Various dams, such as the ones at Liujiaxia and Danjiangkou, had been abandoned in the late 50s. These were needed to provide the huge amounts of electricity demanded by Third Front factories. Additionally, because many of these dams were relatively low dams, making them less vulnerable to air attack, they had preferable designs. The frantic pace of construction really caused issues though. Teams were expected to do all the surveying, design, and construction work simultaneously, a policy literally known as the 3 simultaneities. This led to a variety of issues, from major design flaws to small but costly mistakes like not letting concrete set properly. Many structures were completed on paper in the early 70s, but couldn't be used until the end of the decade due to their many issues that had to be fixed. Still, overall, things were going mostly fine with the Third Front, avoiding being a repeat of the Great Leap as many had feared. This was until the Cultural Revolution. The Third Front's remote work sites were not spared from the chaos and upheaval that consumed China from the late 60s to early 70s. Following Mao's orders to bombard the headquarters, local cadres and administrators were frequently denounced and physically attacked. Technical experts and engineers were also often deemed traitors or capitalist roaders and similarly persecuted. The effect this had was immediate and catastrophic. Completion rates for Third Front projects went from about 70% in 1966 to 35% in 1968. Workers abandoned projects by the thousands, many returning home to coastal cities and refusing to go back. Many city governments, who were unhappy about their workers being sent off to the middle of nowhere without notice, also used the Cultural Revolution as an excuse to keep people from leaving. At completed factories, with many left unoccupied, much of the machinery and tools were looted. The Third Front was essentially aimless for a few years, and it would take another crisis to revive it. After major border clashes with the Soviet Union in 1969, Chinese leadership demanded the Third Front get back on track. Concerned that the Soviet Union may attempt to invade China in a similar fashion to how it invaded Czechoslovakia, the military essentially took over the Third Front. While the project was military adjacent before, now it was under the direct command of the People's Liberation Army. The Office of National Defense Industry would be the highest oversight body, and local revolutionary committees would run individual factories. The army was sent in to restore order at Third Front facilities. Anyone refusing to return to work was accused of splittist activities and called a traitor. Now being under military control, the Third Front also had additional resources and funding available to it. The party ordered in 1969 all economic activity should be focused on building up the defense industry. At its peak, 40% of the national budget was going towards military spending and the Third Front. Rural militias were also called up and mobilized as construction brigades, with the goal of completing projects in quick shock attacks. This new phase was marked by factories with more direct military applications being built. Priority was also shifted away from the southwest and to central and northwestern China. A new doctrine around making any invader face a barrage of a storm of steel at every step was created. A large tank manufacturing complex was built in Shanxi to defend Beijing from a theorized Soviet armored attack. In Hubei, the second automobile works were built in the town of Shiyan, transforming it into a major hub for motor vehicles manufacturing. This particular enterprise is still around today as the Dongfeng Motor Corporation, one of China's biggest car makers. It's a civilian company now though, since the war it was built for never arrived. Ironically, the United States, which spurred the Third Front's construction, would also be the one to end it. President Richard Nixon prioritized normalizing relations with China, mainly to counter the Soviet Union. This culminated in a 1972 visit to China and essentially ended most serious tensions between the two countries. The impending military crisis that had justified the Third Front's secrecy and enormous cost was ended. With this, militarized industrial projects also ended in China. In May 1973, the Third Front officially lost its status as the country's highest economic priority. Projects under construction were cancelled, and existing ones were mostly transferred to civilian oversight in the next few years. Some funding was reallocated to purchasing foreign machinery and hiring foreign experts, instead of trying to build everything domestically. For efficiency, and because inviting foreign engineers to secret factories would defeat the whole point, construction in coastal industrial hubs restarted. The pace of construction greatly slowed, as projects implemented proper management structures, safety measures, and quality control, with a focus on long-term productivity. When workers on the Third Front were allowed to leave their posts freely starting in the 1980s, there was a mass exodus. An average of 30% of technicians chose to leave and find better work elsewhere, a phenomenon colloquially known as jumping into the sea. Those from rural backgrounds, however, largely stayed, with work for state-owned enterprises generally paying better than anything else they could find in their hometowns. The Third Front significantly impacted infrastructure development across the Chinese interior, with major expansions in both the national power grid and mining sector. While these previously largely neglected regions certainly benefited from the railroads, hospitals, schools, and many other things the Third Front brought, economically, the project was still largely a failure. Return on investment for the government was pretty much non-existent, with high maintenance costs and low productivity. Building in remote mountains meant construction costs were typically 10 to 30 times more than in conventional locations. Overall, 52% of Third Front projects were later declared failures by the government in a 1984 assessment. 7% had acute issues, like vulnerability to mudslides or floods, and even radioactive contamination in some cases. Between 1979 and 1990, hundreds of projects were closed, merged with others, or relocated. The opportunity cost was also quite high. The existing industrial base in the Northeast and on the coast suffered from a lack of investment and saw fairly sharp drops in productivity. With such enormous amounts of resources going to the Third Front, for most people in China, they had to live relatively austere lives. During the Third Front's construction, government funding of housing, social services, and urban utilities was the lowest in the People's Republic's history. Per capita consumption of basics like grain and meat remained stagnant during this period. Overall, the amount spent on building the Third Front exceeded that of the first 5-year plan and the Great Leap Forward combined. For most people, they had no idea why this was happening and where all the money was going. It wouldn't be until 1978, 14 years after its beginning, that the government publicly acknowledged the Third Front for the first time. It wasn't even a big announcement or anything, just a tiny detail in a People's Daily article about a worker mentioning he had participated in Third Front construction, an absolutely meaningless detail to most people. During Deng Xiaoping's leadership, the Third Front quietly began to be officially reported on and documented. Today, a significant portion of Third Front projects are abandoned buildings. It never did fight the war it was built for. Millions were uprooted and billions were spent to prepare for a war that was mostly an idea in the heads of those in Beijing. Still, this fear is part of the reason the Chinese interior is as developed as it is. Railroads, power plants, factories, and whole towns exist because of it. While the Third Front made little economic sense, and even its utility as a defensive measure is questionable, it's hard to deny the benefits it brought to many people. The pieces of the Third Front still operational today have outlasted the ideology that built them. The workers that swore oaths against America laid the groundwork for China to become America's largest trading partner. The factories for war instead fuel one of the largest peacetime economies in history.
您好，您拨打的号码不存在，请您查证后再拨。